A North Carolina millionaire dragged 4 hunters into court and told them they owed him as much as $9 million. Their crime? Stepping over the corner of his fence without ever setting foot on his land. He lost. And what he lost should change the way you read every map you've ever hunted. Picture it. A guy buys his tags, gets back to his truck, pulls up his hunting app in the parking lot, and finds out that a big share of the public land, glowing green on that little screen, might as well be on the moon. He can see it. He owns a piece of it. He pays for it every year when his taxes come due, and he cannot legally set foot on it, not because of any law that says the land is off limits, because of a corner. So let me give you the part nobody ever has the time to explain, because once you understand it, you will never look at those green squares the same way again. It starts in southeastern Wyoming, Carbon County, a big, wildlife-rich peak called Elk Mountain. Out there, the land is laid out like a checkerboard, 1 square mile of private ranch, then 1 square mile of public land, then private again, then public, alternating for miles in every direction. And because they alternate corner to corner, some of those public squares only touch the next public square at a single point. 1 corner, a spot with no width at all. Stand on the right side of it and you're on land that belongs to every American in the country. Slip an inch to the wrong side and you're standing in a rich man's ranch. In the fall of 2020, 4 hunters from Missouri, Bradley Cape, Zach Smith, Philip Yeomans, and a friend named John Slowensky, who joined them the next year, worked out that the elk-rich public sections wrapped around Elk Mountain could be reached exactly that way, corner to corner, public to public, never touching an inch of private ground. So that is what they did. They went hunting on land they owned. The ranch noticed fast. A manager came out, told them they were trespassing, and said they needed to leave. They didn't leave. They were on public land, and they knew it. Local law enforcement got called out. And when the deputies heard the hunters out, heard that not 1 boot had touched private dirt, that they'd crossed only at the corner, no charges were filed. The sheriff let it go, but the man who owns that ranch was not going to let it go. He'd been told, when he bought the place, that corner crossing was illegal. He believed the public land woven inside his ranch was his to control, and a group of out-of-state hunters proving otherwise, right in front of his own ranch manager, was not something he was prepared to accept. So the next fall, in 2021, when the same men came back with fresh tags, the ranch was ready for them. At the exact corner where the public squares pinched together, someone had driven 2 steel posts into the ground and strung a chain between them with no trespassing signs hanging off it. A little blockade built right on the 1 point a person would have to cross. A dare. The hunters were ready too. They had built themselves a ladder, a lightweight, folding, homemade thing designed to do exactly 1 job. Let a man climb up one side, pass over the corner, and come down the other, so that not a single boot ever touched the private surface, not even for a step. They set it up over the blockade. They crossed. They went hunting. Later, one of them would say of that ladder with obvious pride that he still had it. And this time, the owner of that ranch decided he was going to make an example of these 4 men. He was going to take them all the way down. His name is Fred Eshelman. He built his fortune in the pharmaceutical industry. Forbes once estimated his net worth at around $380 million, and he owns Elk Mountain Ranch through a company called Iron Bar Holdings. The deeded ranch runs about 22,000 acres of private ground. But threaded all through it are dozens of separate parcels of public land, Bureau of Land Management ground on the order of 11,000 acres of it. Public land that belongs to you and me, and that is nearly impossible to reach without crossing one of Eshelman's corners. And there's a detail here worth stopping on. When Eshelman sued, he told the court that losing his exclusive grip on that public land would gut the value of his ranch. His people first put the damage somewhere between $3 and $7.5 million, and then his hired expert pushed the figure up toward $9 million, on the theory that the ranch would shed nearly 1/3 of its value if regular people could reach the public squares inside it. Sit with what that claim actually says. He was not telling the court the hunters trampled his grass or cut his fence. He was telling the court that the public being able to reach public land was itself the injury, worth millions to him as long as it never happened. His whole case was a price tag on keeping you out. And I'll tell you now how that number ended. A judge threw the expert's figure out as irrelevant and then ruled against Eshelman entirely. Nobody ever paid him a dime. And while we're talking about what that ranch is worth, here's a number to hold right next to the one from his lawsuit. That same ranch he described as worth tens of millions when he was suing over lost access. On the county tax rolls, the whole spread was valued far lower, and Eshelman's property tax bill on it came out to somewhere around $61,000 in a year. Worth a fortune when he's suing over who gets to walk near it. Worth a good deal less when the tax collector comes calling. Make of that what you want. I just think it's worth seeing both numbers side by side. Now, if this were only one rich man and one mountain, it would be a good yarn and nothing more. It is not one mountain. This is the part that reaches out of Wyoming and puts a hand on your shoulder wherever it is you hunt. A mapping company called Onyx went and counted. Across the West, they found more than 27,000 of these checkerboard corners, pinch points exactly like the one on Elk Mountain, and locked away behind them, 8.3 million acres of public land you own, land that, if corner crossing were treated as a crime, you would have no legal way in the world to reach. 8.3 million acres scattered across 11 western states. Wyoming by itself holds about 2.5 million of those acres, and roughly 70% of all of it is BLM ground, the workhorse public land that western hunting lives and dies on. Sit with the scale of that for a second. That is not a rounding error on a map. That is a piece of your public land inheritance about the size of an entire small state, walled off, not by a fence you can see and argue with, but by a legal bluff you can't. And that bluff has a history. To understand why it held for as long as it did, you have to understand how the checkerboard got there in the first place. Here's the mechanism. This is the thing the entire fight turns on, and it almost never gets explained. So stay with me, because this is the payoff. The checkerboard is not an accident of geography. It was built on purpose in the 1860s, and here's why. The federal government wanted the transcontinental railroads laid across the West, and railroads are staggeringly expensive to build. So instead of paying with cash it didn't have, Congress paid the railroad companies in land. It handed them every other square mile section along the route. One section for the railroad, the next kept by the government, the next for the railroad, alternating like a checkerboard for miles on either side of the tracks. That is the origin of the whole pattern. Over the years that followed, the railroads sold their squares off to ranchers and land companies, and the government held on to the squares in between. So what you're left with today, a century and a half later, is this bizarre interlocking grid of private and public that no sane person would ever draw on purpose. Squares of yours and everyone's, touching only at their corners. And the men who ended up owning the private squares figured out something clever, something worth real money. If you own the private sections, and you can convince everybody that crossing at the shared corners is against the law, then the public sections trapped in between become yours in every way that counts. You can't buy them, you don't pay taxes on them, but you can lock them. And by locking them, you get the grazing, you get the game, you get the solitude, you get all the value of that public land, while the public, who owns it, gets nothing but a green square on a map it can't legally reach. Congress saw this exact scheme unfolding well over a century ago, and in 1885, 140 years ago, it passed a law to kill it. The law is called the Unlawful Enclosures Act, and its whole purpose, in its own language, was to prevent the absorption and ownership of vast tracts of the public domain by the very operators who were locking it up. It said, in plain terms, that no one may fence off, obstruct, or block the public from peacefully passing over public land. Not with a physical fence, not with a threat, and, this is the part that matters most, not with the threat of a lawsuit. Now, read the timeline back to yourself. A law from 1885, written specifically to stop wealthy men from stealing public land by blockade, was still sitting right there on the books when Fred Eshelman strung a chain across a corner in the fall of 2021. The tool to break the lock had been sitting in the drawer for 136 years. All it took was 4 stubborn guys from Missouri and a homemade ladder to finally force a court to open the drawer and read it out loud. And here's how complete that bluff had become. When Eshelman explained, under oath, why he believed he could stop these men, he said that when he bought the ranch, he was assured corner crossing was illegal, that he'd checked government sources himself and come away certain of it. And the thing is, he wasn't crazy to believe it. For decades, that was the common wisdom across the West. repeated by landowners, by some in law enforcement, echoed in official-sounding places, the exact opposite of what a 140-year-old federal law said in black and white. The bluff wasn't one man's lie. It was a story the whole system had been telling itself for so long that almost nobody bothered to check whether it was even true. And this, the thing they don't tell you until it costs you a hunt, is exactly what this channel exists to drag into the daylight. So subscribe, because the stuff that quietly robs you of a season is almost never the stuff anyone bothers to advertise. So let's walk through what actually happened in the courtrooms, because this is where people get it wrong, and getting it wrong is how you end up in a real bad spot. There were two completely separate cases. Keep them apart in your head. The first was criminal. At Eshelman's urging, the county charged the four hunters with criminal trespass, the kind of charge that leaves a mark on your record. It went in front of a jury in Carbon County in 2022, and the jury acquitted them, not guilty on all of it. And the verdict came back so fast that a reporter sitting through the trial joked it landed before he could finish his lunch. 6 ordinary people from Wyoming heard the whole thing and decided these men had done nothing wrong. That's the criminal side, done, not guilty. The second case was civil. This is the one where Eshelman sued for money. The up to $9 million claim we already talked about, built on the idea that public access to public land had somehow cost him a fortune, and a federal district judge ruled against him. First, the judge tossed that inflated expert damage figure as irrelevant. Then, he ruled against Eshelman's whole theory, and the reason he gave is the sharpest part of the entire story. Remember the chain and the 2 posts at the corner? The court found that the blockade itself was the illegal act. Stringing that chain across the pinch point to stop the public from crossing to public land was precisely the kind of unlawful enclosure that the 1885 law was written to forbid, which meant Eshelman could not turn around and claim he'd been harmed by hunters going around a barrier he never had any legal right to put up. The blockade wasn't his defense. The blockade was his violation. Eshelman appealed. And in March of 2025, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, a federal appeals court, one rung below the Supreme Court, backed the hunters. Unanimously, 3 judges, 0 dissents. The court held, in its own words, that the hunters could corner cross as long as they did not physically touch the private land. It leaned on that same old enclosures law and said, plainly, that a checkerboard landowner cannot build a barrier whose entire effect is to seal the public off from public land. Now, Eshelman's lawyers were not fools, and they had a real card to play. They pointed to a Supreme Court case from 1979 out of the same checkerboard country called Leo Sheep. In that case, the government had wanted to build a road across a checkerboard corner to reach a reservoir, and the Supreme Court said no, the government never reserved the right to build access across those corners. So Eshelman's argument was clean and simple. If the government itself can't cross the corner to build a road, how can a member of the public cross it to go hunting? It's a fair-sounding argument, and here's why it didn't hold. There is a world of difference between bulldozing a permanent road across a man's corner and a person stepping over it on foot. One is construction, a lasting, physical taking of the private ground. The other is a guy in boots, passing through for a moment, touching nothing. The courts saw that difference clearly. Leo Sheep was about building something on the land. This was about a man crossing a point in the air above it. That old case protected the landowner's dirt. It said nothing that let him lock the public out of everything around it. I'm walking you through the other side's best shot on purpose, because being honest about the strong version of their argument is the only thing this channel really has to sell. When you lay out the landowner's best case, and the court still rules the way it did, that's not spin. That's just the law. So Eshelman took his final shot. He asked the Supreme Court of the United States to hear the case and overturn the 10th Circuit. And in October of 2025, the Supreme Court declined. Now, be precise about what that means, because a lot of headlines got sloppy with it. The Supreme Court did not rule that corner crossing is legal everywhere. It didn't rule on it at all. It simply refused to take the case, which left the 10th Circuit's decision standing as the controlling law in that part of the country. A huge win, but a specific one. And I'm going to show you exactly how specific. One more piece before we get to what all this means for you, because it tells you who this fight really belongs to. These four men were not activists out hunting for a test case. One of them said, flat out, that if it had been left to him, he'd have just paid the $750 trespassing ticket and gone home, convinced he'd done nothing wrong, but not looking to make a federal case out of it. The reason it became a federal case is that the hunting community saw the stakes before the hunters did. A public access group, the Wyoming chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, teamed up with the crew at Meat Eater and raised nearly $118,000 for the legal fight, and they raised it from more than 2,000 separate donations. Regular hunters chipping in $20 and $50 at a time because they understood that four guys from Missouri with a ladder were carrying the access rights of an entire region on their backs. That's not a lawsuit. That's a community putting its own money down on land it refuses to be locked out of. And here's something that ought to land no matter where you sit. This is not a left or right fight, however hard people try to force it into that box. Poll hunters and anglers, and you'll find they lean conservative. A plurality call themselves Republican. But ask that same crowds about keeping access to public land, and Republicans and Democrats answer almost identically. Better than 3 out of 4, on both sides. Locking regular people out of land they already own is one of the very few things the entire hunting world, right and left, agrees to be angry about together. The villain in this story doesn't care who you voted for. He just wanted the gate closed. So here is what this actually means for you, and I need you locked in for this part, because the internet is full of people who took this ruling and turned it into corner crossing is legal now, cross wherever you want. That is not what happened, and swallowing the sloppy version is exactly how a good hunt turns into a court date. Let me draw the line precisely. The ruling is binding in one federal circuit, the 10th. That circuit covers 6 states, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Kansas, and Oklahoma. If you are corner crossing inside those 6 states, stepping from one piece of federal public land to another without touching or damaging any private surface, a federal court has now said you cannot be held liable for trespass for doing it. That's real, and for public land hunters in those states, it is enormous. But look hard at the fences around that sentence, because every single one of them matters. First, it is federal land only. The whole ruling is built on a federal law that protects federal public land. State land is a different animal entirely. Colorado's own wildlife authorities have already said out loud that this decision does not cover state trust land or state wildlife areas, corner cross onto state ground that's ringed by private property, and you may still be trespassing under state law. So know exactly whose public land you're reaching for, because public is not one single thing here. Second, you cannot touch the private surface. Full stop. This entire ruling hangs on the fact that those hunters never put a boot on private dirt. They built a ladder specifically so they wouldn't. The moment your foot comes down on private ground, or you knock over a fence, or you damage anything at all, the protection evaporates, and you are just a trespasser. And this is why the landowner's one genuinely practical objection is not just noise. A lot of these corners aren't physically marked, and the GPS in your phone or your hunting app is only accurate to within several yards. If you cannot be truly certain you're threading the exact corner, you are taking a real and personal risk. Third, outside those 6 states, none of this is settled. Everywhere else in the West, Montana, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, on down the list, the 10th Circuit's decision carries weight, but it is not binding law. Montana's own wildlife agency has stated plainly that corner crossing is still unlawful there. So if you hunt outside the 10th Circuit and you step over a corner on the strength of a YouTube video or a headline, understand what you're volunteering to be, a test case. And let me say the thing I am supposed to say and actually mean it. I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. This is me laying out what the courts have said so you can go and check the law for your own state before you ever put a boot over a corner. Verify it for where you hunt. Don't take a narrator's word, and don't take a forum post's word, and stake your season or your freedom on it. And don't think for a second this is over. It is heating up right now in 2026 on 2 fronts. In Wyoming, lawmakers tried to take the court's ruling and write it straight into state law to end the confusion once and for all and put corner crossing is legal in black and white on the statute books. That bill cleared the Wyoming House. And then this year, it died in the state Senate. 27 votes to 4, strangled by fights over the fine print, whether a crosser could so much as brush a fence post, whether state land ought to be carved out of it. So, in Wyoming today, corner crossing is legal by court ruling, but it is still not written into the statute itself, and the ranching lobby is working hard to keep it that way. Meanwhile, the fight has jumped state lines. In May of 2026, 2 hunting and public access groups filed suit in Montana, taking direct aim at the state's official position that corner crossing there is trespassing. They are trying to do for Montana's roughly 870,000 acres of corner-locked land exactly what the Missouri hunters did for Wyoming's. If they win, the crack that 4 guys pried open with a homemade ladder becomes a doorway swinging across the whole West. So think back to where we started. A man worth hundreds of millions of dollars strung a chain across a corner, called in the sheriff, hired the lawyers, and spent 4 years and a small fortune trying to make 4 ordinary hunters pay for stepping through the air above a fence post. He had every advantage money can buy, and he lost. Because a law written 140 years ago to stop this exact move was still on the books, and 4 stubborn men were willing to stand there and make a court read it. The public land inside those corners was never really locked. The lock was a story a great many powerful people had every reason for you to believe, and no reason at all to correct. 8.3 million acres of it, yours. In 6 states, the courts have finally said so, out loud. In the rest, the story is still being tested, 1 corner at a time. You already paid for that land. Go learn exactly where you're allowed to stand on it, and then go stand on it.